All right, hello everyone, welcome back. I'm Chris, you're listening to Into the Cauldron, and I'm joined today by a guest who I am so excited to talk to. I find his work really, really inspiring, Samuel David. And Samuel is a Mesopotamian polytheist, and you may know him from, because his book, Dumuzid, or The Red Shepherd, a new image of Dumuzid, just got released with Anathema, or you may have read the previous one, One Ring, but he focuses a lot on Mesopotamian mysteries. He is a writer, an educator, and all this amazing things. And we're going to have, I'm sure, what I'm sure is to be an incredible discussion about the Mesopotamian mysteries. So, Samuel, thank you so much for coming on, man.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Wow, I'm so excited to talk to you. We were just talking a little bit before we jumped on here. I hit record, and it's going to be so good. I'm so excited. So Samuel, for people who either don't have your book yet or aren't sort of familiar with your work in general, you work a lot with sort of the Mesopotamian systems and Sumerian systems and this kind of thing. But how would you kind of introduce yourself and your work and things like that for people who haven't heard you before?
Wow,
It's a huge question. I know.
that's a huge question. So let me try and condense it down to 280 characters. That'll make things easier.
Sure.
I am a polytheist of the Mesopotamian variety. I used to identify as a reconstructionist. However, as we study continuation of cult and look to history, it's difficult to narrow things down to one specific period in time to reconstruct. And let's face it, sometimes reconstruction tends to veer into reenactment, and reenactment unfortunately does not carry the same spiritual spark, if you will. So that's my spiritual interest in a nutshell. As far as academic interests or scholarly interests, that's largely, in fact, wholly derived from academic material, not just the old guard material, such as the work of Thorkild Jakobsen, who I had previously mispronounced numerous times as Jacobson, and I was recently educated on the pronunciation of the last name. But academics like Thorkild Jakobsen, academics such as Benjamin Foster, they are the go-tos, if you will, as far as my academic pursuits are concerned. And of course, I have members in my own spiritual community who are both spiritually oriented and minded as well as academically oriented and minded. In fact, one of my friends who I share a great deal of material with and we spend far too much time communicating with well into the night is Steffi von Scott, who's actually an ancient Near Eastern academic and researcher who has been in university for as long as I've known him. So that elusive PhD.
Perpetual PhD. I'm on the same unfortunate journey, I assure you. But yeah. No, it sounds incredible. So how do you, I guess I'll ask you the same question I often ask some of the more like academic style practitioners. How do you generally balance the two? Because it's a very kind of fine line, I think, isn't it? Where you kind of have this, like, we want to stay truthful to academic sources. We want to stay truthful to kind of historical sources because these things, you know, cultures, periods, like you said, they evolve. It's very difficult to kind of focus on any one particular period. So like so do you take in general when you're approaching it, I guess from a practitioner's point of view, do you take a particular period or do you just take an overview of Mesopotamian magic more generally?
I take an overview in my book Rod and Ring. I had initially gone into it from a Sumerian standpoint, but then as I became more informed as far as the practical matter goes, it became, I don't want to say a pastiche. It was more or less a syncretism of Sumerian, Babylonian, Akkadian, and later Assyrian iterations of the spiritual current.
Hmm. Yeah, because like I think also like when you look at just the landscape of, you know, even the Bronze Age in general in Mesopotamia, that's kind of what was happening as well. Even among those cultures, they were sharing a lot of this stuff. A lot of the beliefs were shared among these cultures. Like we have, you know, even if you're looking at things like I don't know, like the Assyrian god Ashur, for example, was only worshipped in like I think it's like Akkad or somewhere like that, isn't it? So like you do have regional specific deities, things like that, but
Right.
on the whole, there are masks and variations and things like that over across, things. Even in my own work, I've done Southern Levantine masks of Dumuzid as well, which are they're like they clearly take from Sumerian sources, but they're putting their own flavor on them. They have their own iconography, and it's all a bit
Right.
different. So, but these things are, I guess it's a part of a wider discussion of exactly how people experience gods and how people approach deities and the mysteries in general, right? But there are so many masks to it, and you can approach it
Mhm.
from so many different angles, especially even in the modern day kind of thing. So let's talk about that a little bit. So how, as a modern practitioner, do you begin kind of approaching the Mesopotamian mysteries?
That is a very dense question. I'm
Mm,
you're throwing dense questions at me, one
I'm
right after
trying
the
my
other.
best. Yeah.
It's I want to say it's easy, but at the same time it's difficult because again, we look at continuation of cult and we look at the original if we were to solely focus on the source material, we look at Dumuzid or Dumuzi
Mm,
as a pastoral figure who, in his earliest incarnations, was a shepherd. And he has three death myths that predate the descent of Inanna by several centuries. So we have the archetypal figure, the youthful figure, the figure who has not yet married or perhaps is still courting his his intended bride. So we have this figure who is either killed by bandits, conscripted by mercenaries from foreign lands, or in one instance is, of course, dragged into the underworld by demons.
yeah.
So there's that iteration, there's that incarnation, and then there's the incarnation of Dumuzid when he is conflated with another god, a god from Lagash or Lagash, whose name is Ashum Galana, which it's quite a mouthful there. And that deity was identified with the date palm harvest
Mm,
and was a martial deity. So we have the pastoral shepherd who dies before his time, dies before he is before he takes on the role as a father. Then we move on, of course, to his agricultural aspect. And in that aspect, not only is he the god of the date palm, he's also a martial deity, but he's also a king and is more I would like to venture and say he is more realized as a figure instead of merely a one-dimensional pastoral deity or pastoral figure who is in many cases likely not even a deity
mm,
at that point, at least in the way he's conceived. Just based on my own research and based on the general academic consensus, he started as a youth who is human or was, and it's likely that he didn't become conceived as a divine being until much later. And we see instances of this in the case of the divine child who, after an untimely death, achieves apotheosis and is essentially deified by the local cult who mourns the child's untimely death.
mm.
And of course, later we see iterations of hero worship and the worship of divine kings who also achieve apotheosis in death. So we have this very layered, this diverse view and this tapestry of, you know, I could just keep
Yeah.
using metaphor after metaphor, but it's incredibly complex as to how this deity evolved and how their cult flourished and took on new iterations from day to day to century and throughout the millennium. It just it's incredible.
Yeah, because I think you touched on something there about sort of the sort of the worship or the elevation of the divine king. And I think from what I remember, what I was doing some sort of precursor reading, even for my thesis a few years ago. So correct me if I'm wrong, I may be outdated. But didn't I think some of the earliest attestations of Dumuzid actually in or as an antediluvian king in the king lists? I think because he appears as a human king, isn't it like a king of I think he appears as a king of Uruk at one point, doesn't he?
Yes, there are two kings. There's the king of Uruk, who is identified as the fisherman, and then there's Dumuzid of Bad Tabira, which is also known as the city of the smiths. So we have these preposterously long reigns. Let's be real.
Yeah.
Which
that's like going down the whole ancient aliens route. Yeah,
we don't talk about that.
Yeah, this is the Zachariah Sitchin free zone. Okay,
exactly. So we have these preposterously long periods of time, which historians still to this day, academics, linguists, there's still this difficulty in determining the actual length. And what's interesting is we have to look at how time was measured, because we come to a point where year one begins with the institution of any particular ruler. So who's to say how they conceive time in that regard? But back to my point, we have two Dumuzids in the historical kings list. We have Dumuzid of Bad Tabira, and then we have Dumuzid of Uruk, who was the fisherman.
Right. Okay. Yeah, because he is, again. I think Dumuzid as a figure. Again, are we clear on which Dumuzid is kind of the one that eventually becomes the deity later on, or is it still kind of in question?
I think that's largely in question, and in fact, and I'm probably getting ahead of myself, but the individual that was my advisor as far as the Sumerian transliterations goes, he and I have discussed this at great length as well. It is likely that Dumuzid or Dumuzi was not just a figure in myth or in various erotic compositions. It is likely that his name itself was an epithet. And what's interesting is we see a lot of figures in the ancient Near East who share many epithets. In fact, he shares epithets with Nergal, which most would think that's rather diametrically opposed to what his cult is all about, but they both share names that pertain to their roles in the netherworld or the underworld. They share names that pertain to them as figures in the land of the living upon the steppe. So we take his name and its meaning as Dumuzid being the good son, the legitimate son, the righteous son. And if we look at how that name figures into the sacred marriage ceremony, it's likely that epithet is used by kings, not so much in the ceremonial sense, but perhaps even in a regnal sense. So not only gods, or not only kings, but also gods, because if we look at his erotic poetry, where he is mentioned, of course, with Inanna or with Ishtar, when we consider his Akkadian or Semitic incarnation, we have other names that are ascribed to him. We have the god Lulal, or the Honeyman, if you will. And then, of course, we have the god that I mentioned earlier with the mouthful.
Yeah,
Ama something.
Ama something. Yeah. So it seems almost like Dumuzid is this like archetypal figure who appears in essentially kind of every kind of literary sort of innovation. Essentially, you have erotic poetry, which is usually associated with Inanna. And I think the thing that's coming to me right away, I think, or the first thing I kind of want to open this up and discuss, and I think this is, if I'm thinking rightly, this is kind of what your book hopes to accomplish. The perception of Dumuzid, like up until this point, has almost been as a very two-dimensional figure. Like the most popular version of him is in Inanna's Descent, where he's kind of just carried by Gala demons, because Inanna kind of comes along and sees him, either sitting on her throne being entertained, or that resting under a tree or whatever it is. And she's like, yeah, he hasn't mourned enough, take him away, right? Yeah. And then he kind of just disappears, and he just kind of becomes this liminal underworld deity. But actually, there is this entire mythic narrative, and even just in general, literary narratives that appear in magical texts, incantations, in erotic poetry, that it really kind of fleshes him out as a much deeper figure than just appearing in the the Inanna epics, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So how do we begin, I guess, I guess to use the title of your book, how do we begin approaching a new image of Dumuzid then? How do we like synthesize all of this into something we can actually make into an archetype or connect with?
So the emphasis of the book in the first part presents him in the mythical narratives, at least as far as what we have to draw from based on what's readily translated and readily available. So I've taken, in fact, let me grab my copy that's so conveniently placed right here.
Yeah.
So
What
a coincidence indeed. So in looking at the texts that I laboriously composed, and these are all derived from source material, the only composition that is not copied word for word, if you will, or adapted word for word, is a lacuna myth that essentially posits the role of Dumuzid in terms of paternity. So we have the apocryphal myth that seeks to establish who his father is, because in many myths there's references to him being the quote unquote shepherd of An being the father of the gods. We have him described as the friend of Enlil, who is the chief of the gods. And then, of course, in certain texts, the erotic poems where he's featured with Inanna, he makes an explicit reference to being the son of Enki. And that goes on to elaborate upon his role, which is explored in the later part of the book, where we look at his role in magic and in exorcism. And that specifically, again, I'm probably getting ahead of myself, but
we can open it. It's a natural direction, I guess. Like
there we go.
Next question of like, how does the Dumuzid feature into incantations and magic?
So we find that evolution taking place in the old Babylonian period. And what's interesting is when we present the word Sumerian and, coupled with the logogram or the cuneiform or the language, if you will, we have this idea that, in the ancient Near East, several millennia ago, there was this pastoral people, but that language or those logograms that were used, that cuneiform script, was taken by the Akkadian people, who assimilated, or rather, let's be real, they colonized the area.
Yeah.
And the Sumerian people were assimilated into their population, and in order to smooth racial tensions and cultural tensions, they adopted Sumerian as the lingua franca. So taking that even further, we can thank the Babylonians for codifying everything that we have and composing these myths and these liturgical compositions and these ritual texts, which I referred to numerous times in putting this work together. And in fact, a lot of the material that is in this book was initially intended for Rod and Ring. However, the scope of that material, in hindsight, was way beyond the scope of the initiatory. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I suppose it is, again, even now, like now we're talking about it, it's a huge thing. So how do you even begin to synthesize that into a book that someone can, especially if it's meant to be an initiatory book, right? If someone who who is maybe not familiar with Mesopotamian mysteries, how do they even begin to approach it? You know, it's a huge question, because you're synthesizing what is essentially, you know, one of, if not the most ancient civilization on Earth. You know, like, but synthesizing this entire thing, it's a monumental task. It really is, I think. So I mean, what was your, I guess, just what was your process, I guess, like in how you were approaching it? I mean, I assume you've been a devotee of kind of the Mesopotamian mysteries even before publishing. A lot of this kind of stuff was, I guess, it's built from your own personal practice and academic research prior to publishing and things like that, right? So how's your personal practice kind of shifted in the process of sort of codifying all this and publishing it as a book?
What's interesting is, in the beginning, when I was fleshing out my practice and trying to figure out, you know, my head from a hole in the ground, if you will, I was referring to a lot of outdated material because, as I've mentioned in numerous interviews, you can't just go to the occult section or the alternative spirituality section and pick up a book about Mesopotamian spirituality as readily as you could books about Norse heathenry or Norse reconstruction, Kemetic religion and reconstruction. So I was at a loss, and my spiritual growth, if you will, was, I don't want to say stagnant, but it kind of plateaued. And I started looking elsewhere and eventually found Simon's Necronomicon, which many people balk at. However, aside from the Lovecraftian elements and some of the chaos magic, I guess you could say, that's added to the text, there is a great deal of material in there that is drawn from historical Mesopotamian sources. So as time went on, I'm piecemeal gathering these things together and completely unaware that there are other people out there who are likewise looking for community. And so one thing led to another, and I'm interacting with people on Facebook and Reddit, and the next thing I know, I'm, you know, ushered into this online community and have met many of these individuals in person and participated in community ritual. And it's been, I feel like ever since that happened, and I actually took the step to step outside or step away from the comfort of a keyboard, if you will, and meet these people in person. It's like I can't even begin to describe what it was like. It's almost like just being pushed down a hill and slowly gaining momentum from there.
Yeah.
And in fact, at one point, over 20 individuals gathered together to consecrate the temple, which I am now the head of. So that was quite an interesting development. And so from there, I've, you know, had opportunities to present at local events, national events, international events, and preach the good word of the Mesopotamian polytheist spiritual current.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's that temple you mentioned. That's the Temple of Sangamon, isn't it? Or Sangamon?
Yes, correct.
Yeah. So is it like I guess we can talk about this a little bit. Is that I guess like a fully functioning like Mesopotamian like in-person mystery tradition, or like a fully functioning temple, or like how does that work?
So it's an initiatory tradition as well as a fully functioning temple. It's very small, of course, because, you know, it's in a room in my own home, but it's solely devoted to that purpose. It's not just a catch-all room in the back corner. It's got a temple set up and everything, shrines to the various deities that are venerated. And it's pretty wild. They travel with me when I go places, so
okay, so
keeping it historical.
Yeah, this is another interesting question, because I guess and I guess we can kind of talk about the mechanics of Mesopotamian or like Sumerian magic in general, because most of my background is in Egyptian stuff and in Greek stuff for the most part. I'm not as familiar with Mesopotamian stuff outside of maybe Babylonian astral magic and the Babylonian astrology and things like that. So in terms of I guess when we're getting into sort of practical worship and devotional practice and things like that, what is the general kind of characteristic of the magic? Are we talking kind of statues and venerations and what, like, offerings to statues and things? Is there like a parallel with like the Egyptian opening of the mouth? Because like if you look at things like Hermetica, we have statue animation and things, and statues are animated in the temples. I mean, is there kind of Mesopotamian parallels to that in the
Yes.
yeah.
Yes, absolutely. So whereas in Egypt you have the opening of the mouth, in Mesopotamia you have the washing of the mouth.
Okay.
So the elements are quite similar. The deities themselves, their idols are believed to, or historically believed to, house the deity. It wasn't just the representation of the deity on earth. It was the deity. It was treated as a living, breathing thing. Now, of course, to keep things practical, I'm not going to consider the effigies that I've made as the living embodiment of the deity on earth, because
Cool.
you know
Yeah.
that,
When you stuff them into a suitcase, that's probably not the best use.
no, it's not. So in fact, I'm looking at one of the effigies now, which is actually Dumuzid, because during the production of the book and everything, I've made sure that he is front and center so I can give him that daily acknowledgement. But the images that I've made are life-sized masks, if you will, that have been ritually imbued with the quote unquote animating spark, if you will. And they are to serve as the representations of the gods. They're focal points in ritual, focal points in ceremonial, and even in devotional rites that I perform. So
Yeah, that's amazing. So, how do we? I guess another part of this question. It's a very kind of popular discussion that ends up happening in occultism in general and magical practices about kind of how we determine sacred space and whether we're using circles and things like that. And we have some variants of like magic circles and things that delineate sacred space in Egyptian sources and things like that. But there are arguments that even some of the circles that we find in things like the Greek magical papyri and the demotic ritual manuals, that they come from Sumerian sources. I think the word for it is zisuru or something like that, isn't it? Where it's
yes,
a circle of cornflower or something like that. And I think
correct.
it's, from what I remember, it's used in, I think it's the Muklu incantation texts, right? Which is like they're like exorcism rituals for the most part, where it's
Yes.
sprinkled around the bed or something like that, isn't it? And you have different forms of substance, like different kinds of flour for different god, whether it's Minsaba or Enki or anything like that. So
Correct.
do you use? I guess we can talk about this in general, but like, do you use circles like that in your practice when you're making sacred space, or is it something else?
If I'm doing a public ritual, or if I'm doing one that has, a more complex setup as opposed to, just a general devotional ritual, then yes, I'll use flour. And of course, historically, there were three types of flour that were used. One of them was associated with necromantic rites and the banishing of sorcerers. Unfortunately, some of the terms are difficult to translate because we don't know specifically the ins and outs of everything. But in this day and age where flour is processed and bleached, and we have all of these different methods of purifying it, it could be any type of flour. My personal choice is to use barley flour and to mix it with water that's consecrated for the purpose. And in fact, the ritual that was performed to consecrate the temple and establish this temple, there was a massive circle, a massive circle of flour that was used and mixed with water, and we formed this beautiful circle of dough. And after the ritual, I'm sure that there were many thankful birds that consumed those
Yeah.
bits of dough that were left over.
Yeah, well, it's also it's interesting. You're like, I'm having things like pop up from like flashes in my mind now of things I've just remembered and read, or like whether it's about Dumuzi or anything else. But because isn't there a variant of like part of the Dumuzi myth? I think it even appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where like Enki or somebody transforms him into a bird. Like it's like isn't it like an alalu bird or something like that, like a broken wing?
So that's in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and what happens is Ishtar or Inanna. In fact, in this iteration of the myth, it is Ishtar because it's composed by Babylonian scribes. But Ishtar takes a liking to Gilgamesh because who wouldn't?
Sure.
He is said to be the epitome of human perfection on Earth. Of course, he's also part deity.
Hmm.
we, that's another story in and of
Kind of
itself.
cheating in
But
general, but
a
yeah.
lot of cheating. But Gilgamesh rebuffs Ishtar's advances because he knows that anybody that she lays eyes on and develops quote unquote feelings for tends to meet a bad end. So in this case, he refers to Dumuzid or Tammuz as the Alalu bird whose wing was broken and, daily cries, my wing in the forest. So we have that. And then, of course, we have Dumuzid transformed into other creatures. But yeah, to your point.
Yeah, I remember because there are other variants of it where I think I can't remember if it's in the Return of the Muzid or one of the other mythic narratives around him where he doesn't get immediately captured by the Gala demons. Like he goes to Enlil, Enki or something, and they help him out by hiding him or transforming him into a gazelle or something like that. That
Yeah,
gets
yeah.
given
He
an immense.
appeals to Utu or Shamash, who is the solar deity
Yeah.
and Inanna's brother, twin brother. And in one iteration of the myth, he's transformed into a gazelle. And in another iteration of the myth, he's transformed into a serpent. It's known as a sakal serpent. And what's interesting there is that type of creature has more divine aspect or
Mm.
more divine connotation. So if we were to translate it and take that context into consideration, it's likely that he would have been transformed not just into a tiny snake. He would have been transformed into a basilisk who flies over the mountains. So yeah, there's that interesting parallel in one liturgical text actually, where he's described as a dragon who glides over mountains.
Hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, so are there? Is he described differently, or are there, I guess, different masks and images of the music depending on the genre of the literature? So, like is he
Absolutely.
certain ways in erotic poetry, and is that different to how he's referred to in like exorcism rites, for example?
Yes, absolutely. So in erotic poetry, he's, ascribed more agricultural uh, attributes. So in some compositions, he's referred to as a farmer. In fact, one of the spicier narratives is Inanna praising his virtues and basically saying to Dumuzid, uh, more or less, plow my vulva like you
Yeah,
would
this is
a
it's a
fertile
famous one,
field.
I think actually. Yeah, I
Hmm.
remember it's like when like it doesn't it even eventually form part of like Inanna's descent where when she comes back and sends him off to the underworld, she eventually just gets like she regrets it because she gets lonely, and then like it's part of that whole tradition where it's like she's lonely because no one's like plowing her vulva or anything. Not like regretting her whole decision because there's nothing there. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's funny, yeah. But so it seems like this image of him as kind of the shepherd
Mhm.
is kind of I almost want to say the most popular version. Like it's a very common version that comes up. Like
Mhm.
is the shepherd narrative, I guess, one of the older ones that has remained sort of consistent, or
Yes, it appears that that is the most consistent iteration. And of course, if we look at the iconography of the shepherd and its relation to kingship
Hmm.
in Mesopotamia, it was believed that the king was the symbolic shepherd of the people were sheep, and the city was the sheepfold, and it's pretty self-explanatory from there.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
of course we have aspects of this in the early Jewish texts that would then become the Old Testament. We have aspects of this with um, the various Egyptian kings, the Hyksos, if I
mm,
recall correctly, who I mentioned in the book, who were the shepherd kings of Egypt. So shepherds, kings, they tend to go hand in hand, Jesus Christ being the
The
the good
archetype.
shepherd himself.
Yeah,
So
yeah. Well, yeah, 'cause it's interesting you mentioned Jewish texts. I think there was I can't remember which scholars exactly. I remember reading something a while ago that there are sort of parallels between sort of the original sort of Genesis narrative with Cain and Abel and Dumuzid in general. Because if you think about the narrative, it's essentially two brothers competing for divine favor, and the
mhm.
god eventually favors the shepherd over sort of the agriculturalist and anything like that, right?
Yes.
So like that, there are instances of that going back to, I guess, the stories of Dumuzid, right,
Mhm.
and narratives around that. So I mean, um, how does this understanding or this narrative of the shepherd, I guess, apply, I guess, to practice and engaging the mysteries, I guess, in this, or engaging Mesopotamian mysteries as a whole, I guess, because we are, I guess, moving towards, I don't know what's opening it. If we're opening this up as a practice and sort of moving into sort of being initiated into Dumuzi's current, as an example, how does him featuring as a shepherd kind of affect us in our practice? How does it affect how we can approach him as an entity or as an archetype?
So I know that most people think of the idea that sheep are ignorant and easily swayed because we have that as a term to denigrate people that go with the flow. But within the context of the book, taking Dumuzid's role as a shepherd into consideration, the supplicant, if you will, or the would-be ritualist approaches Dumuzid as though they were a proverbial sheep. So whether that would be a ram, whether that would be a ewe, whether that would be a lamb, they are petitioning Dumuzid as a shepherd to usher them into his fold, and from there slowly build this practice. And in fact, along with shepherds come hounds, and we have the hounds of Dumuzid that are featured in the Descent myth, as well as the other myths and compositions relating to his role as a shepherd. Those actually factor heavily in this book as well. So there is a ritual in the text that evokes those dogs that are in his retinue, if you will. And there are 7 names that are ascribed to this dog or to this hound that speak to that dog's character. That in the Descent myth or his death myths, where he's being pursued, the hound is referred to his noble dog, his shepherd dog, his lordly dog, and his faithful dog. So it's interesting how all these things come together and potentially lend themselves to this initiatory praxis that is a continuation of his cult.
Hmm. Yeah, because I guess because his cult, I guess this is it's a common misconception I find in, especially with modern occultists in general. People have they have a perception sometimes that cults are very static things, that you're worshipped in the temple and then like it doesn't really spread out from there. It's kind of interesting thing. But Dumuzi is, as well as being a Sumerian god and eventually being translated over to Akkadian, his cult spread like far and wide. Like it was a
Yes,
massively popular cult. Like there are even the Aphrodite Adonis variant in Greece is essentially a continuation, I think, of his cult, right?
absolutely. And what's interesting is it varies from city to city, from settlement to settlement. So in a way, and this is perhaps the best analogy to use, it's no different than modern aspects of Catholic folk practice
Hmm.
involving the Virgin Mary. You have Mary as the redemptrix, the great redemptrix, but then you have Mary as a pastoral figure that's appearing to children in mountainous villages like Our Lady of Fatima. So it's interesting how these phenomenal cosmic beings, or these sublunar beings, or intelligences, however you want to describe them, have these various roles in the grand scheme of things and in the small scheme.
Hmm.
So
Yeah, well, I guess as part of the discussion of the roles, then I guess that's kind of the function that like epithets and names serve as well. Like
Mhm.
when you're referring to them by different epithets or different names, you're essentially calling up different aspects of them or different roles that they're working.
Right, right.
I guess because you mentioned the like the Simon Necronomicon a bit earlier as well. It's like one of the big but the big popular parts of that is the 50 names of Marduk towards the end,
Yes.
right? So I mean, is there any kind of is that actually like an actual Sumerian practice, or was that like just for the Necronomicon? Like, do we have a similar kind of idea and practice where you are sort of calling the different names and epithets of deities, and in that kind of invokes different versions of them in Sumerian or Mesopotamian stuff?
Not necessarily, and in that regard, that was largely a modern conceit because the ancient Mesopotamians, the 50 names of Marduk, the whole emphasis of the 50 names as a whole, those are solely informed by the Enuma Elish or the Babylonian creation epic. So in order for him to get what he wants, which is supremacy over all of the gods have to agree to his terms and conditions. So I will take over the charge and slay Tiamat and deliver all of my divine brothers and sisters to to greater glory. However, I would like to have 50 names of power, and essentially that is actually religious propaganda. That whole myth was written by his priests to elevate him over all of the other gods. So while one would look at those 50 names as names that belonged to 50 other gods, at the end of the day they're essentially just titles that he holds, and Marduk is Marduk regardless of what name you refer to him as.
Mm.
um but I do actually have a similar setup, if you will, where Dumuzid is ascribed all of his epithets that are historical in nature. So
Mm. Yeah, so I suppose like I guess in practice it would be something similar to like the Orphic hymns, for example. So like when you're
yes.
wanting to recite, well, I guess like in terms of like a very practical ritual, for example, I guess in the same way that like an astrological magician or a grimoire magician might recite the Orphic hymn while they're imbuing a talisman or calling
Mhm.
down a spirit or intelligence. I guess you can kind of do something similar where as part of your devotional practice you will read like mythic narratives or you will recite the epithets and the name
Correct.
and whatever they're doing, right? And that kind of brings you into sort of connection with them.
Right.
So how does that kind of how does that work in practice? I mean do you like the incense? Do you like sprinkle the circle or whatever it is and then begin reciting, or is there a wider sort of deeper theological process to it? Or
So, in my own practice, and in fact, a lot of elements of that practice are included in Rod and Ring. So there is the presentation of incense offerings, and if it's going to be a major ceremonial ritual working that isn't devotional in nature, then I will incorporate other offerings and other other requisite duties. But the usual methods or the usual procedure would be prostrating before the shrine idol, um, striking my chest 7 times and doing that, reciting um, various passages or liturgical phrases, if you will. And then, of course, there's the presentation of the requisite offerings, the acknowledgement of the deity, and then the lengthy prayer that goes with it. So
mm, yeah, I mean, are there any kind of sort of astrological correspondences to this kind of thing? So I mean, especially with Babylonian ideas, like the Babylonian astral religion and astral magic was a major focus. Are there considerations of like astrological timing and sort of a similar system like planetary hours and things like that to when you're performing this kind of thing, or is there any? Or do we not really focus on it?
if it's something that I feel would require it, like if I were to do a major working for someone who asks for a ritual for whatever reason, then I'll take those various things into consideration as far as the planetary hours are concerned, the day of the week, the various astrological correspondences for that day of the week. So, for instance, in one ritual that I've done, it involved dream divination, and I made sure to perform that ritual on a Monday in the hour of the moon and dedicate that to the god Nana, or Sin, who is the lunar deity who oversees, all sorts of various domains, including what historically would have been considered wisdom, which we would now understand it to be both astronomy and astrology. So we've got those wild correspondences there that, if we squint, they come into play.
Yeah. So I mean, how does I guess working with, let's say, Babylonian astrology, how does it differ from something like Hellenistic astrology? I guess because the associations and things will be obviously different, because like the gods will be different, that kind of thing. But are there any kind of distinctly, I guess, like astral magic practices or anything like that, or sort of astral religious practices that rely more on specifically Mesopotamian astrology as opposed to like things that we can take from Hellenistic?
So as far as the Babylonian astrological praxis is concerned, it's largely omens oriented. So if Saturn is in the sky and there's a specific phase of the moon, then obviously that's not a good sign, because Saturn was also known as the Black Star, and was rather ominous.
Yeah,
and
as it still is. Yeah,
as it still is, exactly. And then we have appearances of astral bodies such as Sirius, which was also considered an ominous star and was identified with deities like Gula or Bao, who had some interesting traits that were similar to Inanna at one point in time. So yeah, it really depends on the phase of the moon. If we were to look at things historically, what the king was doing that day or that month, or what the festival was, and the timing.
So that's interesting. So I guess, did the king, like all the king's activities, factor into divination as well?
The king's activities did factor into divination, because we have to look at the king not just as a ruling figure, but he in many ways was symbolically a high priest. So he was the excuse me, the initiate to the deity's mysteries. It wasn't just the priest, it was him, the priest, and the deity. So we've got that dynamic that exists there too.
Yeah, because I think the like sort of the previous generation of scholarship, when they were looking at things like the sacred marriage, or the sacred marriage ceremony, it was a very popular thing in kind of 20th century scholarship to believe that, like, sort of the king, in his role and guise as the high priest, would usually have ritual sex or intercourse with the high priestess of Inanna, like during sort of the kingship ceremony or anything like that. From what I've heard, that's kind of fallen out of favor a bit more, like in recent scholarship, in place of kind of it's like a symbolic act rather than an actual physical like intercourse was going on, things like that.
Exactly.
But there is that interplay there between the high priestess of Inanna and, I guess, the king as in his role as high priest, or sort of shepherd of the people, right? And then there's like an interplay between those two, I guess. So how did the high priest? Because I guess in that sense, if is there, I'm picturing it now. Is there a connection where does, I guess, Dumuzid have kingship associations as well, in the sense that if he's the shepherd, then
yes,
and the people, is there a play on that where the king is sometimes associated with Dumuzid or as a mask of Dumuzid as well?
Yes, absolutely.
So with that, I guess, how would the king and the high priestess of Inanna then have reenacted the mythic narratives as part of their religious duties?
What's interesting is, while we do have textual sources, we have quote unquote data, if you will, that we can refer to. As far as the ins and outs and the intricacies of these rituals, we don't really have much to go by, other than the nature of this ceremony being symbolic, as a whole. There is one text, however, and I cannot remember the title of this text, but it is included in Benjamin Foster's Akkadian anthology, and the title of that anthology is Before the Muses. But it does describe the king dressed in wool. He's wearing a woolen mantle, and as he approaches the temple where the high priestess is, there are various individuals who are like picking pieces of or tufts of wool off this mantle. But it then switches perspective to the high priestess, who is to receive him, and alludes to her ambiguity and her hesitancy, and just the whole, I've never had sex with a guy before, what do I expect from this? So and what we anecdotally, what we have to also take away from this is, historically, and this is attested in myth as well, historically there were classes of priestesses who were forbidden from having sex and from having children. So they could adopt, but they were forbidden under threat of death from engaging in any intercourse with a man whatsoever.
Yeah, so I think because there are, I guess this is the one, I guess one thing to talk about or open up a bit about just the different classes of ritual specialists across sort of Mesopotamia in general. So I mean, we mentioned priestesses there and different classes of priestesses. Do we have kind of similar things for like exorcists and priests, even of Dumuzid in general, of different classes of ritual practitioner who specialize in different things in general?
Yes. So we have the Ashipu priest, who was the exorcist. We have the lustration priest, who was responsible for purification rites. We have individuals who are referred to as the Gala, or the Galatora, who were priests that were responsible for singing lamentations. We also have the retinue of priestly figures that are known as the Kurgara, who wielded weapons. As far as the width and breadth of their role, it seems to largely be ceremonial in that regard. So they are bearers of weapons in ritual processions. They also shed their own blood in these ritual processions. So it's interesting, because if you look at the religious practices in the Middle East and into Southeast Asia, especially with Islam, and specifically the Shia Islamic sect, we see aspects of ritual mutilation and bloodshed in various I don't want to say cultic practices, but various practices, as far as lamenting the nephew of the prophet, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, because I'm recalling even in sort of archaic Greek Goetia, for example, about the funerary laments in Greek stuff. It's a similar idea, like as part of the prophasis procedure, which is like the funerary procedures for the Greeks. The women of the family, usually the head woman, so like either the wife or the mother of the deceased person, she will usually tear her clothing and sort of beat her chest at the funeral, as part of the kind of the wailing and the lamenting procedure. And that's kind of the origin of actually the Goetic tradition as well, where like the Goetia has its origins in funerary laments before it sort of eventually becomes associated with medieval stuff.
Right.
But it was actually the familial funerary lament. So it was kind of considered like the informal funerary lament in opposition to the thronos, which was the like the professional mourners, I guess.
Right.
I mean, do we have any kind of parallels to that in Sumerian stuff, like in terms of funerary magics or funerary rites or anything like that? Were there professional mourners that would have also had a similar role, or?
Those professional mourners would have been classified as Gala or Galatura priests, so they would all be in that same class. But we have aspects of the cult of the polis, or the cult of the city, and then we have the individual cults of the household. So what's good for the city may not necessarily be good for the household as a whole. So
Yeah, and I suppose when we're talking about household cults, we won't know, I guess, archaeologically, just like the full extent of household practice as opposed to like institutional practice, because it doesn't survive as much, I guess. But would they have had like household shrines and their own statues in there if they were doing personal practice, things like that, as opposed to going to...
yes, and with regards to the household cult, it's usually aimed at venerating the ancestors and ensuring that the ancestors are recipients of frequent libation offerings and food offerings, and the god of the house that would be worshipped would typically be the patrilineal god of your distant ancestor who was worshipped from one generation to the next. Or perhaps if it's not just that one god, it may also be members of that god's divine family.
Yeah, I suppose that may overlap with city gods as well. Like if you're part of a city and things like that, and your
Yes.
family is or they are generationally living in the city,
Mhm.
but generations and like that. If the god is a founder of the city, then you will be in your sort of in the entourage of your god, I guess, and you're worshiping it in
Yes.
all temples and at home and stuff as well, right? Yeah. So, how does I guess outside of the focus of veneration, I guess would the ritual practices and devotional practices more or less be the same outside of the focus? So like in the home, they're focusing on the ancestors and the patrilineal god, whereas in the city, they're focusing on maybe the citywide deity or national deities or anything like that. But in how they're approached, would they more or less be? Is it similar methodologies and things like that?
Oh, definitely not. Because with
Okay.
regards to worshiping the god as the deity of the city, there's a great deal of pomp and circumstance,
Mm.
and the average citizen wasn't necessarily a participant. They were largely an observer
Right.
and looking at things from afar. Whereas if we were to look at, say, Carnival or Mardi Gras, where there's this procession and everyone's having fun and it's wild, and there's an air of frivolity, that's one thing. But then if we were to look at things from the state cults perspective, it would be very solemn procession of the deities, and I'm sure that those who did not act in accordance with that with the custom would probably find themselves at the end of a stick.
Yeah, a very very awkward long stick. Yeah.
Very awkward long stick.
Yeah, because I think going back to Dumuzid real quick here, because I think in the I can't remember if it's the Babylonian calendar or Sumerian calendar, there was a month during the summer months, I think, where like, at least where Dumuzid is conceptualized as being in the underworld, where it was kind of like there was a state like a state instituted or like month-wide mourning for him
Mhm.
during this month, I think, and that
Yes.
like a statewide or like a region-wide procession and funeral sort of lament essentially for a whole month,
Hmm.
right?
Yes, and that would be, we actually find that month captured in the liturgical calendar, the liturgical Jewish calendar, as the month of Av, originally known as Ab or Abu. And basically, when the grass had withered and died completely, there was a state sanctioned statewide mourning where people would publicly wail in the streets for a period of 3 days, and after that time had ended, then they would have a period of festivity and return to their day-to-day lives.
Hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. So I guess we're coming up on now here. We could start beginning to wrap up. The other I guess the other thing I was curious about, we talked a lot about the Dumuzid as the shepherd, I guess, or his archetype as the shepherd. I want to talk a little bit now towards the end here of his other archetype of, I guess, Dumuzid as being in the underworld or like
Mhm.
some kind of underworld deity. Because obviously like usually like we focus a lot more on all his kind of multifaceted nature before he goes into the underworld, as a result of kind of Inanna's I guess, pointing the finger or accusation, and then him getting dragged off by demons, essentially. But what is kind of the mythic narrative around his descent into the underworld? Like, does he feature as a kind of an underworld god? Is he syncretized with like Nagal, for example, or anything like that?
So he is featured as an underworld deity. There is a composition, an elegate composition concerning a historical king, Ur-Nammu, also known as Ur-Nammu, who dies, descends into the underworld bearing gifts. And what's interesting is Dumuzid is mentioned second to Ereshkigal as receiving offerings, and Nergal is mentioned afterwards. So it was attested during that period in history where Dumuzid was conceptualized as a deity who wasn't just bound in chains, um,
Yeah,
waiting
carried
to be
off.
free.
Yeah.
Yes. And what's interesting is, in addition to that designation, or that appointment as being second to Ereshkigal, we also have incantation texts and various hymns in which he is petitioned to take restless spirits into the underworld with him. He's petitioned to take sickness into the underworld because it was believed that disease and sickness originated in the underworld and either were brought into the world of the living by demons, or if there happened to be a crack or crevice that a deity wasn't mindful of, it could sneak its way up and wreak havoc on humanity. And what's interesting is, in addition to death and disease, as far as these spirits go, there's another incantation where the petitioner is requesting that Dumuzid intervene and essentially act as their safeguard and command demons to afflict the tormentor of the supplicant. So it's interesting because there's this very liminal aspect to Dumuzid, that we have him as the shepherd, we have him as an aspect of the king, and in this instance we have him as a necromancer and an exorcist. And I'm very firm in this stance that while Hecate appears to be the figurehead of the current zeitgeist, with
Yeah, the witchcraft movements and everything.
exactly with the witchcraft movement, we have other deities like Dumuzid who embody these same traits, these same tropes, these same roles, wear the same masks. So I think it's always important to give reverence where reverence is due, when we've got this one goddess who's got all of the attention, whereas other gods and spirits are like, hey, guess what, we've been here too.
Yeah. It's I suppose, yeah, I get, we touched on it at the beginning, right? But I guess it just speaks to, you can't go to the religious and folklore section of your local store and pick up a text on Sumerian stuff,
Right.
or Mesopotamian stuff. It's just not. I mean, even yeah, it's like I'm trying to think now of like other than your book, or like any academic texts, like. Well, even then, like, again, when I think about Sumerian or Mesopotamian religion and ritual, it's predominantly all academic texts by default to. Like, there's very, very few like public, quote unquote public books out there that aren't heavily academic and heavily rooted in like academic scholarship and things that are often hard to read and things like that, right?
And readily accessible and readily affordable. I don't know
if when am I talking about Brill, if you can afford like $200 for a single book, then that's fine.
My gosh. And what's wild though is, despite the fact that there are all of these crazy expensive books with limited runs, we talk about occult publishers and the inflated price of a book, but clearly no one's paying attention to these university presses releasing
it's
$300 for a paperback. But what's great is a lot of these academics are putting their work out there as downloadable PDFs. If you were to go to websites like academia.edu, you'd be surprised just how many authors have actually put whole books out
Mm.
that they've written that are, comprised solely of their thesis or,
Yeah.
joint
Yeah, no,
joint research.
I've seen the same thing, and like it's also one of those funny things where I always give where people come to me and ask me like about this all the time. It's really hilarious. But like one of the pieces of advice that I often give people is like academics love sharing their work in general. They're like authors, like they love being spoken to because like most people when they get into academia, they do it because they love the subject. They love talking
Yes.
about this stuff, right? It's like I often found like I could be slightly biased because I had my background in academia anyway, but all my lecturers, even though I graduated a couple of years ago, I'm not actively involved right now. Like, I can still email any of my lecturers and be like, "Hey, I saw your new book is out. Like, but it's like $300. Can you send me like some chapters?" And I'm like 9 times out of 10, they're like, "Yeah, sure." Like it's fine. It's like if
And
you have
instead of chapters, it's the whole book.
yeah, and then I wake up the next morning. It's like I have like a 2 GB email attachment. I'm like, oh my god, but it's like it's a really funny thing because people are like, oh, academic material is so inaccessible. It's like, no, the publishers are quite inaccessible. But if you find the author and you email the author, usually they're quite happy to share their stuff with you
Yeah.
most of the time.
I would say that more often than not, it's the occult authors that are inaccessible.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, like fine. Tell you what, no, I went through this whole binge of like going into like Taoist magic for a while. Like I was really into
Mhm.
like Chinese stuff because like it's another thing similar like Mesopotamian stuff where it's like outside of China, like you don't really have a lot of stuff on Taoist magic, right?
Right.
Or Taoist folk magic, right? And I was kind of looking at it and I found like 2 or 3 occult authors and they are impossible to get a hold of.
Hmm.
Like they went like I tried to get on Twitter and like tweet them, but now like since Musk has like changed how Twitter works, like unless you're verified, you can't message people. And I'm like, it's like it's so difficult to get a hold of authors. It's like it's such a shame because I feel like it's such a wasted opportunity for like good interactions and things
Yeah.
as well. Like if you're as an author, if you're coming on podcasts or you're having an active Instagram account or active social media or whatever, like you can share extracts and things like that, and you can just build
Right.
a community in general, right? It's like that's kind of the big thing there, where it's like I think community is a big part of mysteries in general. And I think
Absolutely.
often overlooked. I think, or like there is, I think it is kind of a fad at the moment, or it has been a fad for the past few years, to like the solitary practitioner, like self-initiation and anything. And don't get me wrong, like self-initiation can work, absolutely. I'm not disputing it in any way, but like I think there is, we talk about this at the beginning, but there is something that is gained in person.
Mhm.
Like you can't
Yes.
describe those experiences where you come together in person and you experience part of the mystery together by doing communal ritual. You can't get that just from reading a book or just from doing self-initiation. I think there is something that I guess it connects you to that kind of communal, like ancestral lineage almost, like the sort
Right. Right.
of ancestral, right? Where you're interacting with something and bouncing off the other person, and that creates like an atmosphere in general that you work together, right? And it's like how I guess to end, I guess, on this here, but uh, working with people in person like you have, I mean, what I know it's hard to describe, but like some of the main differences between sort of doing work on your own and then doing it in a communal setting, like how does the atmosphere kind of shift and how does the energy kind of shift?
So when you're practicing by yourself, when I'm practicing by myself, there are always these moments where there's either synchronicity or perception or something that happens, and I'm always hesitant to, take it at face value
Mm.
because because of my background growing up in the charismatic Pentecostal faith, where everything is a sign from the gods, or
Yeah.
everything is a sign from God, and in
Right.
this case, it's like everything is a sign from the gods. Well, not necessarily, but there are instances in shared ritual where everybody has the same experience. Everybody witnesses the same phenomenon. Everyone has that same visceral response, and at the end, when we hesitantly share those experiences, everyone's eyes get wide and they're like, "Oh my God,
Yeah.
that happened to me too." In fact, if I may, there was one incident where several individuals were participating in this ritual, and it was to consecrate an item that was dedicated to a Mesopotamian god. And we were to, through the course of this ritual, essentially mimic a rainstorm in order to consecrate this item. And at the end of that ritual, there was a shower that started, and that shower became a very torrential storm, and that storm lasted for 3 days. There were parts of the city that were flooded. So it's interesting when these synchronicities happen, and they're witnessed by more than one individual, and more than one individual is affected by these synchronicities.
Yeah, I'm smiling right now. I'm trying so hard not to smile and give it away, but like I have to put this out there, and I want to put it out there, and like again, just for reference, me and Samuel haven't met each other. We haven't this is the first time I'm hearing about it. But believe it or not, that kind of experience was exactly the experience I had when I was doing work with the 50 Names of Marduk in the Summer Necronomicon as well, where I was doing work with it. I was doing, I can't remember which name I was working with now, but when it was a couple of years ago when I was working or I was living in London, I was doing a consecration ritual or a devotional ritual, and I was using some of the 50 Names of Marduk, and the first thing that happened was a rain shower started, and then it just kept going for like 2 days. And when I saw it on like the news, it was like it was a completely like clear thing for the 2 days. Like, the weather forecast was completely clear. And then like it was just weirdly synchronistic in the sense of like I was a solitary practitioner back then, so I didn't how you do it in group or anything like that. But as soon as I finished like the incantation calling the names, the rain started. And it was one of those situations where like there was no clouds, there was no cloud in the sky, it was completely clear night. Second I finished speaking the incantation and the calling the name, it starts and it doesn't stop for 2 days. And like all the weather broadcasters in London were like, it's like, it's a completely like the weather forecast was completely clear for 2 days, and it's like it just I did this ritual with the 50 Names of Marduk, and that's exactly what happened. Like the rainstorm started, and it sits there and it makes me think. I'm like, yeah, like this seems like it's a thing. Like
it is a thing.
I could definitely see like a theophany of like rainstorm or anything like that being relevant to like a shepherd-based society or like an agro-pastoral society, right? Because the raining or whatever, it increases crop fertility, right? So I could definitely see how that would, I guess, be one of the most prominent signs of a deity's appearance or deity's like interference or presence, whatever like that, because that's one of the ways they can show themselves, essentially, one of the main ways. But that's really interesting you mentioned it, and now I'm like, wow, okay. That's very validating for me.
Well, here's 2 other instances that will validate your experience. In a ritual that I led for Paganicon, which involved Marduk and his 50 names. In fact, the attendees would recite those names in succession. And at a certain point in the ritual, the fire alarms in the hotel went off, and there was no cause for it. No cause for it whatsoever. That same ritual was performed with the local pagan group that I was a part of that was active for several years. And we were outside in very temperate summer weather. It was at night, and we had torches that were lined up around the perimeter. We had offerings and, candles lit. And as soon as a certain point in the ritual happened, this wind came out of nowhere. Again, the forecast was clear. There was no bizarre weather pattern in sight. And at that key point in the ritual where the battle between Marduk and Tiamat was, ritually reenacted, this wind came out of nowhere, blew out all of the torches, except for one tiny candle that the flame had diminished, but it was still persisting throughout the entire thing. Just fascinating how these things happen.
Yeah. God. Yeah. Like because you can't even make it up. It's like it's too specific, I think. Like the fact that it happens almost on command.
Yeah.
Like it's too specific to be like, because like I'm the first to like discount this stuff. a lot of the time. I'm one of the first to be like, no. Like I have to go like put everything I experience through like 3 layers of like, well, this could be like why it happened, this could be why it happened, whatever it is. Like I take like a 3-pronged approach where like I have to try and disprove whatever like experience I have. I try and disprove
Yeah.
3 times at least, like through other means before I accept like there's some like weird like some like theophany, whatever it is. It's like every time I've tried to do that, I failed. Because like, every time I try and do it, like my experience is like just too weird to be like, okay, yeah, it's either too synchronistic, it's either too on command working, or the way like a visionary experience comes through, or some like alteration of conscience comes through. It's so weirdly consistent with how like ritual experiences are described in liturgical texts or anything like that, what that I haven't read before working with them. You know, I've had that with not so much with Mesopotamian stuff, but with Egyptian stuff especially, where I'll go and do a ritual from like the Greek magical papyrus, something like that, and I won't read like the extra comments at the end. I'll have some experience with it, then I'll go back to the papyri, I'll read the papyri, and the magician will be describing my experience exactly.
Yes.
And I'm like, I didn't read that before that, and now I'm like something's like coming in together. I'm like, huh.
I did a working I did a working from the PGM, the ritual to encounter the serpent-faced god.
Yeah.
And it was so fascinating because in the room that I was in, it was there I have pets, so I hear the pets walking around outside of the room. And suddenly when I started the ritual, it got so quiet that I thought, what are my pets up to? Because a quiet pet is like a quiet child. There's something happening.
You always need to know.
Exactly. And the room became incredibly quiet. And then there was this creaking sound, like the whole house was settling, and it just went around me the entire time. And I was just I was at a loss for words, but then I thought, okay, let's go back and look at this again, and try and piece it back together. And yeah, same thing happened. It's like, what is going on here?
But I guess like again like that, I guess that's one of the ways you experience mysteries like that.
Yeah.
Like you go through it, you read it, you're like, oh, okay, there you go. Like there's actually some like validity to what I'm going through here. It's a whole thing, I guess. But it's fun. So I guess if we're moving towards wrapping up, then yeah. Obviously your new book on Dumuzid is out now with Anathema. Your previous one, Ron Ring, has also been out for a while now, I think,
Yes.
right? But in general, I guess how to cycle back to one of the first questions I asked like an hour ago or so, for people wanting to get involved with kind of the Mesopotamian mysteries and begin to be initiated into Mesopotamian traditions, or want to start working with traditions like that, what are some kind of things that you suggest as first steps? I guess familiarizing yourself with the myths and things like that, right?
Definitely familiarize yourself with the myths. I know that many people don't want to dig into mythology because for some it's a dry subject or not exactly interesting. But look at these myths not as scripture, which many people do, and unfortunately that does a disservice. Look at these myths as glimpses, as insights as to how these gods were conceived, or how aspects of these gods were conceived by those who worshiped them. And also, don't just focus on the myths. Look at the liturgy that is written and dedicated to these gods, because it takes glimpses of those myths and expounds upon them, and we find out more about the character of these gods that are conceived by their historical worshippers.
Yeah, amazing. So you are also at the end there. So you are on Instagram at Robin Ring, and again, your book is out. So for people who want to connect with you, they can do it there. And
Yes.
get your book as well. So is there anything else? So what's your kind of any next projects or anything you're currently working on that you want to share?
Yes, next project I actually have, since the occult world does not seem to have much in the way of representation of the Mesopotamian gods. taking it upon myself to develop idols that could, I don't want to say be mass produced, but produced on a larger scale. So yeah, look out for that soon. It's gonna be interesting. So if there's anyone out there who has a 3D scanner and a 3D printer and wants to help with this project, please hit me up online at Rod and Ring on Instagram, or email me rodandring@gmail.com. I'm also pretty responsive on Facebook. You just search for me as Samuel David, and there I am.
Brilliant. All right. Well, we can probably call it there, I think. So, Samuel, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.